The massive station hung in space like a metal mountain floating among the stars. Captain Jake Morrison had seen many things in his 20 years of space travel, but nothing like Galactic Council Station Omega 7. The structure stretched for miles in every direction and gleamed with lights from 1,000 different worlds. Ships from hundreds of alien species docked at its countless ports while others waited in neat lines for permission to approach. Jake stood on the bridge of the human exploration ship UES Horizon and watched the view screen with growing unease. 3 weeks ago, his ship had been exploring the outer rim when the message came through. All human leaders were to report to Station Omega 7 immediately. No explanation was given and no refusal would be accepted. The Galactic Council had spoken and humans would obey. President Lisa Hayes paced nervously behind Jake's chair. She had insisted on coming aboard the Horizon rather than taking her own diplomatic vessel. Admiral Frank Collins stood nearby studying tactical displays with the focused attention of a career military man. Both leaders had been briefing Jake on what little they knew about the Council for the past week. The Council had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years. Every species that developed space travel eventually met their representatives and submitted to their authority. The process was always the same, according to the few records humans had managed to gather. A species would be observed for several decades, then summoned to one of the great stations for a ceremony. After that, they became part of the galactic community under Council guidance. Jake had read the reports, but something felt wrong about the whole situation. The Council ships they had encountered were impressive, but their crews seemed more interested in watching than fighting. Human scientists who had studied Council technology found it advanced but not impossibly so. Yet every species in the galaxy feared them and obeyed without question. The communication channel crackled to life and an alien voice filled the bridge. The translator struggled with the strange sounds before settling on words that made Jake's skin crawl. The voice belonged to Ambassador Vexthal, and it spoke with the casual authority of someone who had never been disobeyed. Human vessel U will dock at port 712. Your leaders will report to Amphitheater Prime in 1 standard hour. Bring no weapons and no recording devices. The ceremony of acknowledgement will proceed as it has for 3 millennia. Your species will take its proper place in the galactic order. The channel closed before anyone could respond. Jake looked at President Hayes and saw his own concerns reflected in her eyes. The words "proper place" carried an ominous weight that made his stomach tighten. Admiral Collins was already checking his sidearm and Jake could see the older man's jaw working with barely controlled anger. The docking process took 30 minutes and Jake spent every second of it studying the alien ships around them. Most were sleek and beautiful in ways that human engineering had never achieved, but they all shared one common feature. Every ship he could see bore the same symbol somewhere on its hull, a circle with radiating lines that reminded Jake uncomfortably of a spider's web with something trapped in the center. The station's corridors were wide, enough to accommodate beings of every conceivable size and shape. Jake walked slightly behind the official delegation, but his role as security chief meant he was still part of the group. He watched the aliens they passed and noticed how they all moved aside when they saw humans approaching. Some looked curious, but most seemed to regard the human delegation with something that looked like pity. Amphitheater Prime turned out to be a vast, circular chamber that could have held 50,000 beings. Tiered seating rose up on all sides, and every seat was filled with representatives from species Jake had never imagined. There were creatures made of living crystal, others that looked like walking trees, and beings of pure energy contained in mechanical suits. At the center of the chamber stood a raised platform where Ambassador Vexthal waited. The alien was 12 feet tall and built like a living sculpture of blue-green crystal. Its compound eyes reflected the chamber's lights in patterns that hurt to look at directly. When it spoke, its voice echoed from speakers placed throughout the amphitheater, and the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. Humans of the species designation Earth Prime, you have been observed for 50 of your years. Your technological development and social structures have been evaluated and found acceptable for integration into the galactic community. You will now perform the ceremony of acknowledgement and accept your classification as a Class 7 developing species under Council guidance. Jake felt his blood turn cold at the words under Council guidance, but President Hayes stepped forward, with diplomatic training taking over. She began to speak about humanity's desire for peaceful relations and mutual cooperation, but Vexthel cut her off with a gesture that somehow conveyed absolute dismissal. There will be no discussion. The ceremony is not a negotiation. You will kneel before the Council's authority as every species has done before you. You will acknowledge your place in the hierarchy that maintains galactic peace. You will submit. The word submit hit Jake like a physical blow. Around the amphitheater, thousands of alien beings watched with the bored attention of spectators at a routine performance. This was clearly something they had all seen many times before. The powerful and proud reduced to supplicants. Begging for scraps of dignity, President Hayes looked back at her delegation with confusion and growing alarm. Admiral Collins' face had gone completely red, and Jake could see the older man's hands clenching into fists. But the pressure in the chamber was overwhelming. The weight of thousands of watching eyes and the casual certainty in Vexthel's voice made resistance seem impossible. One by one, the human leaders began to kneel. President Hayes hesitated for a long moment, then slowly bent her knee. Admiral Collins followed with visible reluctance. The other officials and diplomats knelt in turn until only Jake remained standing at the back of the group, Vexthel's compound eyes fixed on him with sudden interest. The ambassador had clearly expected the ceremony to proceed exactly as it always had, but now something was different. The alien's voice boomed across the chamber as it addressed Jake directly. Human, you will kneel and complete the ceremony. All beings kneel before the Council's authority. There are no exceptions, and there have never been exceptions. You will kneel now. Jake looked at his leaders kneeling before the alien ambassador. He looked at the thousands of beings watching from the seats above. He looked at Vexthel's crystalline form, radiating absolute confidence that this human would obey just like every other being in the galaxy had obeyed for 3,000 years. Then Jake Morrison straightened his shoulders and spoke. The word that would change everything? No. The silence that followed Jake's refusal seemed to stretch across the entire galaxy. In Amphitheater Prime, 50,000 alien beings sat frozen in their seats while Ambassador Vexthel's crystalline form pulsed with colors that had no names in human language. The compound eyes that had never seen defiance now stared at the one human who remained standing among his kneeling leaders. President Hayes tried to salvage the situation with desperate words about cultural misunderstandings and human inexperience with galactic protocols. Admiral Collins attempted to order Jake to comply while other officials whispered urgent pleas for him to reconsider. But Jake Morrison stood motionless with his arms at his sides and his eyes fixed on the alien ambassador who ruled over countless worlds. Vexthel's voice when it came was different from before. The casual authority was gone and replaced with something sharper and more dangerous. The alien spoke in its own language first, and translation systems throughout the chamber struggled to convert concepts that had never been needed before. When the words finally came through in human speech, they carried the weight of 3,000 years of unchallenged power. This is impossible. No species refuses the ceremony. No being denies the Council's authority. You will kneel now or face consequences that your primitive mind cannot comprehend. Jake felt sweat running down his back, but his voice remained steady when he answered. I said no, I won't kneel to you or anyone else. If that's what joining your galactic community requires, then humanity doesn't belong here. The amphitheater erupted in sounds that human ears had never heard before. Alien voices created a cacophony of shock and disbelief, while beings that had submitted centuries ago watched something they had thought impossible. Some species made noises that sounded like laughter, while others produced sounds that could only be described as wonder. Vexthel raised one crystalline arm and the chamber fell silent again. The ambassador's form had grown brighter and the patterns of light flowing through its body moved faster than before. When it spoke again, its voice carried the cold finality of a death sentence. The human Jake Morrison will be detained for crimes against galactic order. He will be executed as an example to his species and to any others who might consider following his path. The remaining human delegation will complete the ceremony and humanity will accept enhanced oversight to prevent further incidents of this nature. Security forces moved toward Jake from multiple directions, but the damage was already done. The word "no" had been spoken in front of representatives from every major species in the galaxy. Recording devices that were supposedly forbidden had captured everything, and within hours the impossible scene was spreading through quantum communication networks faster than Council sensors could respond. Jake was taken to a detention facility deep within Station Omega 7, but his imprisonment became the least important part of what followed. On mining worlds where enslaved populations had forgotten the meaning of resistance, workers began to whisper about the human who wouldn't kneel. In agricultural communes where endangered species toiled under council quotas, farmers dared to lift their heads and imagine a different kind of life. Dr. Amy Parker received the first reports while working in her laboratory on Earth. As a xenobiologist, she had access to communication networks that most humans never saw, and what she discovered changed everything she thought she knew about the galaxy. The Council's authority was not built on military might or technological superiority. It was built on fear and the carefully maintained illusion that resistance was impossible. The species that served as Council enforcers were not volunteers, but conscripts whose own worlds had been conquered generations ago. The vast fleets that intimidated entire civilizations were mostly automated drones, designed to look threatening rather than fight prolonged battles. The Council maintained order through psychology, not force, and Jake Morrison's simple refusal had cracked the foundation of their power. On the mining world of Kepler 442b, a Zephyrian worker named Kethver stopped his drilling for the first time in 20 years. The blue-skinned humanoid had heard the transmission of Jake's defiance, and something long buried stirred in his chest. Around him, other workers paused in their tasks, and for a moment the endless sound of extraction equipment fell silent. The silence spread to other mining platforms as word passed from worker to worker. The humans had said no to the Council, and somehow the galaxy had not ended. If one species could refuse to kneel, then perhaps others could remember what freedom felt like. The work stoppage lasted only minutes before Council overseers restored order, but those minutes planted seeds that would grow into something much larger. Commander Zektar of the Draconian species found himself assigned to guard Jake Morrison and discovered that rebellion was contagious. The reptilian officer had served the Council for 30 years without question, but now he struggled with dreams of his homeworld before the conquest. Images of draconian cities that had burned when his people finally submitted after decades of feudal resistance. Jake spent his days in a cell that was comfortable by galactic standards, but still a prison. His guards rotated regularly, and he noticed that each one looked at him differently than they had before. Some showed hatred for the trouble he had caused, but others displayed something that looked almost like hope. He was no longer just a prisoner, but a symbol of something that had been missing from the galaxy for 3,000 years. The Council's response was swift and predictable. Emergency sessions were called and new protocols established for dealing with defiant populations before the contagion could spread further. Enhanced surveillance was implemented on worlds where unusual activity had been detected, and enforcement fleets were dispatched to trouble spots with orders to restore proper order, but for every transmission they blocked, 10 more got through. For every rebellious worker they detained, a dozen others learned that resistance was possible. The carefully maintained system of psychological control that had kept the galaxy docile for millennia was breaking down, one conversation at a time. On Proxima Centauri, the Altarian farmers who supplied food to 3 different star systems began to ask questions they had never dared voice before. Why did they work endless hours to feed Council worlds while their own children went hungry? Why did they accept quotas that left them barely enough to survive? Why had they forgotten that their ancestors had once chosen their own leaders and lived according to their own laws? The questions led to quiet meetings in storage facilities and abandoned greenhouses. The meetings led to plans that would have been unthinkable weeks before. The Altarians had always been considered one of the most compliant species in Council space, but Jake Morrison's example had shown them that compliance was a choice, not a law of nature. President Hayes and Admiral Collins returned to Earth with the news that humanity was now a supervised species under enhanced council oversight. The alien delegation that accompanied them made it clear that any further incidents of defiance would result in severe consequences for the entire human race. Earth's leaders were forced to publicly condemn Jake's actions and promise full cooperation with council directives, but the public statements could not erase what had happened. Humans had seen one of their own refuse to kneel before alien authority and somehow survive the experience. The story spread through human space despite official efforts to suppress it, and with each telling it, grew larger and more inspiring. Dr. Parker established contact with resistance cells that were forming throughout council space. The communications were heavily encrypted and routed through networks that the council had never bothered to monitor. Species that had been isolated from each other for centuries began to share information and coordinate activities. The galaxy was starting to remember what it had forgotten during 3,000 years of enforced peace. Some beings were meant to be free, and freedom was worth fighting for even when the odds seemed impossible. Jake Morrison had lit a spark that was spreading faster than the council could contain it. In his cell on station Omega-7, Jake could not know that his simple refusal was changing everything. But he could see it in the eyes of his guards and hear it in the whispered conversations outside his door. Something was happening, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Judgment Fleet materialized at the edge of Earth's solar system like a collection of metal predators emerging from hyperspace. 12 Council dreadnoughts accompanied by twice as many support vessels formed a battle line that stretched across millions of miles. Each ship was larger than anything humanity had ever built, and their weapon systems could crack planets if turned to full power. Admiral Ben Taylor watched the alien armada from the bridge of his flagship and felt his stomach drop. The Earth Defense Force consisted of 47 ships that had been built for exploration and trade rather than war. Most were converted cargo haulers and research vessels, hastily fitted with whatever weapons could be mounted in their cargo bays. Against the approaching Council fleet, they looked like fishing boats facing battleships. The Council's message was brief and delivered with the cold efficiency of beings who had performed this task countless times before. 3 major Earth cities would be destroyed as punishment for Jake Morrison's defiance and as an example to any other species that might consider following humanity's path. The demonstration would be surgical and precise, with casualties limited to exactly what was necessary to restore proper order. Admiral Taylor had served in Earth's military for 30 years, but he had never faced anything like this. The tactical displays showed enemy firepower that could overwhelm his entire fleet in minutes, while his own weapons were barely adequate for point defense. Every strategic analysis concluded that resistance was suicide and surrender was the only rational choice, but Jake Morrison's example had changed the rules about what was rational. The man who refused to kneel had shown that some things were worth dying for, and Admiral Taylor found himself faced with a choice that would define humanity's future. He could surrender and watch Earth's cities burn while hoping for mercy, or he could fight and give his species a chance to die standing up. The Admiral's decision came through fleet communications with quiet determination. All ships, this is Admiral Taylor, we're going to fight. We're probably going to lose, but we're going to make them work for it. If we're going down, then we're taking some of them with us. Captain Steve Morgan commanded a converted or hauler, called the Fighting Chance, and received the Admiral's orders with grim satisfaction. His ship was armed with mining lasers that had been jury-rigged into weapons, and a crew of volunteers who had signed up knowing they might never see home again. The ship's cargo holds were filled with kinetic projectiles that could be launched from modified loading systems. The Battle of Earth's orbit began when the Council fleet moved into range and opened fire with weapons that turned space itself into a deadly light show. Beams of energy that could melt asteroids lanced toward human ships, while exotic particles created fields of destruction that no earthly technology could match. The human fleet scattered and tried to use guerrilla tactics against an enemy that had expected easy compliance. The first human ship to die was the exploration vessel New Horizons, which vanished in a ball of plasma when Council weapons overwhelmed its shields. But before it died, the ship managed to ram a Council escort vessel, and both ships exploded in a blast that lit up half the solar system. The alien crew had never faced an enemy willing to die just to inflict damage, and the successful ramming attack sent shockwaves through their formation. Steve Morgan brought the fighting chance in close to a Council dreadnought and discovered that the enemy's greatest strength was also a weakness. The massive alien ship was designed to intimidate and overwhelm, but its weapons were too powerful for close combat. At point-blank range, the Council gunners could not target the small human vessel without risking damage to their own ship. The fighting chance attached itself to the dreadnought's hull like a parasite and began cutting through armor with mining lasers never intended for warfare. The alien crew tried to shake off the human ship but could not fire on it without destroying themselves. Other human vessels saw the tactic work and began similar attacks, while Council commanders struggled to adapt to an enemy that fought with complete disregard for survival. The battle raged for 6 hours and ended with Earth's orbital defenses in ruins and most of the human fleet destroyed. Admiral Taylor died when his flagship was vaporized by concentrated fire from 3 Council dreadnoughts, but not before his sacrifice allowed other ships to escape. The Council achieved their objective and began the bombardment of Earth's surface with weapons that turned cities into craters of molten glass. New York disappeared first in a blast that could be seen from space. Berlin followed minutes later, and then Tokyo was erased from existence with the casual efficiency of beings who had performed similar demonstrations on countless worlds. 3 million humans died in the space of an hour, and Earth's leaders received a simple message that more cities would follow if humanity continued to resist, but something had gone wrong with the Council's plan. The images of human ships fighting to the last bolt were spreading through galactic communication networks faster than sensors could react. Species that had submitted without a fight centuries ago watched humans ramming ships 5 times their size and began to remember what courage looked like. Dr. Amy Parker had established her resistance cell in an abandoned mining station beyond Pluto's orbit and received reports from across Council space that made her heart race with excitement and terror. The Zephyrians on Kepler 442b had begun organized sabotage of mining equipment, and Council overseers were reporting significant production delays. The Altarian farmers on Proxima Centauri had stopped delivering food shipments and were ignoring demands to resume work on dozens of worlds that had been peaceful for generations. Beings were asking questions that had not been heard for millennia. Why did they serve masters who offered nothing but fear? Why did they accept lives of endless labor for the benefit of others? Why had they forgotten that their ancestors had once chosen their own paths through the galaxy? Commander Zektar received new orders to execute Jake Morrison immediately as an example to any other potential rebels, but found himself unable to comply. The Draconian officer had watched the battle of Earth's orbit through security feeds and seen humans die fighting against impossible odds. Their courage had awakened something in him that 30 years of military conditioning could not suppress. The commander looked at Jake through the energy barrier of his cell and saw not a criminal but a catalyst for something that had been building for centuries. The human had spoken one word that was changing everything, and now the galaxy was beginning to remember what freedom meant. Jake himself had followed the battle through fragments of communication that leaked through the station's security systems. He knew that Earth had been attacked and cities had been destroyed, but he also knew that his people had fought back. The knowledge that humans had chosen to die fighting rather than live kneeling filled him with pride. That was stronger than grief. The Council convened emergency sessions to deal with the spreading unrest, but their traditional solutions were failing. Enhanced security measures only created more rebels, while shows of force convinced populations that had nothing left to lose to take desperate chances. The psychological control that had maintained order for 3,000 years was breaking down as species after species began to remember their own capacity for resistance. On Vega, Prime the aquatic ceruleans emerged from their designated territories for the first time in 2 centuries and began moving toward population centers that had been forbidden to them. On Volf 359, the silicon-based Crystallians stopped processing materials for Council megastructures and started asking why they had accepted servitude in exchange for mere survival. The fires that Jake Morrison had lit with his simple refusal were spreading beyond any possibility of control. The galaxy was learning that submission was a choice, not a natural law, and that some things were worth dying for. The Council's perfect order was coming apart one act of defiance at a time. In her hidden base beyond Pluto, Dr. Parker worked frantically to coordinate the growing rebellion while Earth-surviving military leaders planned their next moves. General Kate Barnes had escaped the orbital battle in a damaged cruiser and was already talking about building a real fleet from salvaged technology and alien allies who were beginning to switch sides. The galaxy was at war, but it was not the kind of war the Council understood. This was not a conflict between nations or species, but a revolution of consciousness that was spreading faster than any fleet could travel. The age of enforced peace was ending, and what would replace it was anyone's guess. General Kate Barnes drifted through the asteroid belt in a ship that barely deserved the name. The vessel had been cobbled together from the wreckage of 3 different Council ships and held together with human ingenuity and desperate hope. Its hull showed the scars of the Battle of Earth's orbit, and its systems ran on power cells that should have been replaced months ago. But it was alive, and it was free, and that made it more valuable than any Council dreadnought. The hidden base that Kate had established in the ruins of an old mining station was growing every day. Ships arrived bringing refugees from Earth and volunteers from species that had decided the galaxy's oldest empire needed to end. The base looked like a junkyard where someone had tried to build a civilization, but it represented something that had not existed for 3,000 years. It was a place where beings from different worlds worked together without masters or hierarchies. Jake Morrison had been free for 6 months since Commander Zektar released him from Station Omega 7 and joined the rebellion. The Draconian officer had brought with him detailed intelligence about Council military capabilities and the locations of secret prison worlds, where rebellious populations had been sent to disappear. Jake now commanded a mixed fleet of human and alien vessels that looked like pirates but fought like angels of liberation. The ship Jake flew was called the Defiance, and it had been built from parts that should never have worked together. Human fusion drives powered systems designed by crystalline engineers, while weapons from a dozen different species created a fire combination that confused both friend and enemy. The crew was equally mixed, with humans working alongside Draconians, Zephyrians, and members of species that most Council citizens had never heard of. Their mission was simple and completely impossible. They were going to break open the prison worlds, where the Council sent populations that refused to submit. Each facility held millions of beings from species that had chosen resistance over survival and been erased from official records. The Council pretended these worlds did not exist, and their prisoners had been forgotten by their own people. The first target was Kepler 186f, where the entire Nyxarian species had been imprisoned after their homeworld revolted 50 years earlier. The Nyxarians were shapeshifters who could take any form they chose, and their rebellion had terrified the Council into unprecedented brutality. An entire species of billions had simply vanished from galactic records overnight. Jake brought the Defiance out of hyperspace at the edge of the system and immediately detected the automated defense platforms that surrounded the prison world. Each platform was armed with weapons that could destroy capital ships, and they were programmed to fire on any vessel that approached without proper authorization codes. The system was designed to keep prisoners in and rescuers out, but Zektar had brought more than just intelligence when he joined the rebellion. The Draconian commander still had access to military networks that the Council assumed were secure, and he provided authorization codes that had been updated just hours before. The defense platforms recognized the Defiance as a legitimate vessel and allowed it to pass through their perimeter. The prison world itself was a nightmare of gray concrete and energy barriers that stretched from horizon to horizon. Millions of Nexarians lived in conditions that barely qualified as survival while automated systems monitored their every movement. The shapeshifters had been forced into standard humanoid forms and forbidden to change. Under penalty of immediate execution, Jake led a landing party that included humans, Draconians, and volunteers from 6 other species down to the planet's surface. They moved through the prison complex like ghosts while Zektar used his command codes to disable security systems. The liberation was not a battle but a revelation as cell doors opened and beings, who had been forgotten by the galaxy, remembered what hope felt like. The Nexarians at first could not believe that rescue was possible. They had been told that their species was extinct and that they were the last survivors being kept alive only as specimens for Council scientists. When Jake Morrison stood before them and spoke of rebellion spreading across the galaxy, many thought they were hallucinating or that this was some new form of psychological torture. But the truth was more wonderful than any lie. The galaxy was at war and the old order was crumbling. Species that had submitted for centuries were remembering their capacity for resistance, and the Council's perfect peace was collapsing into beautiful chaos. The Nexarians were not the last of their kind, but the first to be freed from a prison that would soon be empty. The liberation of Kepler 186f took 3 days and resulted in 4 million Nexarians joining the rebellion. Their shape-shifting abilities made them perfect for infiltration missions, while their hatred of the Council burned with the intensity of 50 years of imprisonment. Within weeks, they had spread throughout Council space, gathering intelligence and recruiting allies from populations that had thought themselves alone. Similar liberation missions followed as Jake's fleet moved from prison world to prison world. Each success brought new allies and new capabilities to the rebellion, while demonstrating to the galaxy that the Council's power was not absolute. Beings who had been written off as extinct returned to fight for freedom, while species that had submitted began to question why they had ever believed resistance was impossible. The Council's response was predictable and brutal. The enforcement fleets that had not seen real action for centuries were deployed to crush the rebellions spreading across their territory. Elite units trained for intimidation rather than warfare found themselves facing enemies that refused to be intimidated, and the results were catastrophic for both sides. On Kepler 442b, the Zephyrian uprising was crushed with overwhelming force. Council ships turned the mining platforms into slag, while troops hunted down rebels with methodical efficiency. The survivors were loaded onto transport vessels and shipped to prison worlds that were themselves under attack. The Council won the battle but lost the war as images of their brutality spread to every corner of the galaxy. The aquatic Ceruleans on Vega Prime faced a different fate when they refused to return to their reservations. Council forces poisoned their water supplies and forced them back into designated areas through environmental warfare that left thousands dead. But the Ceruleans had tasted freedom and would not forget what it felt like to swim in clean water under open skies. Dr. Amy Parker coordinated the rebellion's communication networks from her base beyond Pluto and watched as the galaxy transformed itself through millions of individual acts of courage. Species that had never spoken to each other were sharing intelligence and resources, while beings that had been enemies for generations discovered they had common cause against their mutual oppressors. The most significant breakthrough came when Zektar made contact with other Draconian commanders who were beginning to question their loyalty to the Council. The reptilian species had been among the Council's most reliable enforcers, but watching humans fight against impossible odds had awakened memories of their own conquest centuries earlier. Draconian military units began to defect in small numbers. At first, then in entire formations, as commanders realized they were fighting to preserve a system that had never offered them anything but servitude. Their ships were among the most advanced in Council space, and their addition to the rebellion changed the balance of power in dozens of star systems. Jake found himself commanding a liberation fleet that included vessels from 20 different species and carried crews that represented every major group in the galaxy. The ships were mismatched and their tactics were improvised, but they shared a common purpose that made them more effective than any force the Council had ever assembled. The rebellion was no longer a collection of isolated uprisings but a coordinated campaign to overthrow 3,000 years of enforced order. Worlds that had been peaceful for generations erupted in revolution, while species that had been scattered across the galaxy began to reunite and remember their own histories. General Barnes received reports from across Council space that painted a picture of an empire in collapse. Trade networks were disrupting as member species refused to deliver goods to Council worlds. Military units were defecting faster than they could be replaced. Administrative centers that had governed the galaxy for millennia were being abandoned as local populations expelled their Council overseers. The galaxy was burning with the fire of freedom, and no amount of force could extinguish flames that had been lit in the hearts of countless beings. The Council still controlled many worlds and possessed weapons that could destroy entire civilizations. But their authority was crumbling as species after species chose uncertainty over security. In his command center on the Defiance, Jake Morrison studied star charts that showed rebellion spreading like wildfire across Council space. The man who had refused to kneel was now admiral of a fleet that carried the hopes of worlds that had been enslaved for longer than human civilization had existed. The galaxy would never be the same, and whatever emerged from the chaos would be built on the simple principle that no being should have to kneel to another. It was a dangerous idea that would lead to conflict and uncertainty for generations to come, but it was also the foundation. Station Omega-7 hung in space like a dying star surrounded by the greatest fleet battle the galaxy had ever seen. 2 years after Jake Morrison refused to kneel, the massive structure that had intimidated species for millennia was under siege by ships from dozens of worlds that had remembered what freedom meant. The Liberation Fleet had grown from a handful of desperate rebels into an armada that stretched across light years of space. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the battle unfold through viewports that showed destruction on a scale that made the Battle of Earth's orbit look like a training exercise. Council dreadnoughts that had never faced real opposition traded fire with rebel ships built from salvaged technology and pure determination. Explosions lit up the darkness while fighters from 100 different species swarmed through the debris fields. The ship Jake commanded was no longer the cobbled-together vessel he had started with, but a true warship built by the combined efforts of the Free Worlds Alliance. The Unbroken carried weapons designed by species that had been scattered across the galaxy and brought together by their shared hatred of tyranny. Its crew included humans, Draconians, Nexarians, Zephyrians, and beings from worlds that had just learned. They were not alone in their struggle. General Kate Barnes coordinated the fleet movements from her command ship, while Captain Steve Morgan led fighter squadrons that had been reinforced by pilots from every member species of the Alliance. Commander Zektar commanded a task force of Draconian vessels that had abandoned their council allegiances to fight for something better than order. Maintained through fear, the battle had been raging for 18 hours and neither side was giving ground. Council forces fought with the desperation of beings who knew their empire was crumbling, while rebel ships attacked with the fury of populations that had been enslaved for centuries. Ships died on both sides in explosions that could be seen from neighboring star systems, but the fighting continued without pause on Station Omega-7 itself. Ambassador Vexville watched the destruction from the same amphitheater where Jake Morrison had first refused to kneel. The crystalline being's form no longer pulsed with the confident light that had once intimidated entire species. Instead, it flickered with unstable patterns that reflected the chaos, consuming everything the Council had built. The amphitheater that had once held representatives from across the galaxy was now nearly empty. Most species had withdrawn their delegates when the rebellion began, while others had openly joined the alliance against their former masters. The few remaining Council loyalists huddled in their seats, like survivors of a shipwreck watching the ocean rise around them. Reports flowed in from across Council space, painting a picture of total collapse. Entire sectors had declared independence and were refusing to acknowledge Council authority. Military units that had been the backbone of galactic order for 3,000 years were defecting in massive numbers. Administrative centers that had governed countless worlds were being abandoned as local populations expelled their overseers. The rebellion had spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined when Jake Morrison spoke that first simple word of defiance. Species that had been scattered across the galaxy for centuries were reuniting and remembering their own histories. Worlds that had never communicated with each other were forming alliances based on their shared desire for freedom. The battle for Station Omega-7 reached its climax when a group of Council ships attempting to flee the system were intercepted by Nexarian shapeshifters who had infiltrated their crews. The shapeshifters revealed themselves and took control of the vessels from within, while rebel forces moved in to accept their surrender. The sight of Council ships switching sides in the middle of combat broke the morale of many remaining loyalists. Units. Ambassador Vexthal received word that the station's defenses had been breached, and rebel forces were moving through the corridors toward the central command complex. The ambassador had never imagined that beings could fight with such determination against overwhelming odds, but had learned that freedom was worth any sacrifice to those who had been denied it. Jake Morrison led the boarding party that finally reached Amphitheater Prime, where everything had started. He walked through corridors filled with the debris of a collapsing empire, while his mixed crew of humans and aliens secured each section. The energy that had once made the station feel alive and dangerous was flickering like a candle in a storm. The amphitheater was dark when Jake entered, except for the emergency lighting that cast strange shadows on the empty seats. Ambassador Vexthal stood alone at the center of the chamber, where countless species had been forced to kneel over the millennia. The crystalline being's form was dim, and its compound eyes reflected defeat rather than authority. "Human Jake Morrison," the ambassador said, and its voice no longer echoed from speakers throughout the chamber. "You have destroyed everything that maintained order in this galaxy. Billions will die in the chaos that follows, and countless worlds will burn in wars that could have been prevented." Jake walked down the steps toward the center of the chamber, followed by Zektar and representatives from a dozen species that had fought to reach this moment. His footsteps echoed in the vast space where so many beings had been forced to surrender their dignity and freedom. When he reached the platform, he stopped just outside the circle where Vexthal waited. "The order you maintained was built on fear and slavery," Jake replied. "You kept the peace by crushing anyone who wanted something better. Maybe there will be wars and maybe billions will die, but at least they'll die free instead of living on their knees." Vexthal's form pulsed with patterns that might have been desperation or rage. "I offer you terms human. Share power with the Council and help us restore stability. Your species can have a place of honor in the galactic hierarchy. You can rule over worlds and guide the development of lesser species. All you have to do is accept that some order is better than chaos." The offer hung in the air like a poisonous cloud, while Jake considered words that would have tempted any reasonable being. Power over worlds and the chance to guide galactic civilization towards something better than what the Council had created. All he had to do was compromise on the principle that had started everything. Jake looked at the empty amphitheater and imagined it filled again with representatives from across the galaxy. But this time they would not be supplicants forced to kneel before alien masters. They would be free beings choosing their own paths and making their own mistakes. It would be messy and dangerous and sometimes tragic, but it would be real in a way that the Council's artificial peace had never been. "No," Jake said, and the word carried the same weight it had carried 2 years earlier when one human refused to kneel. "We didn't fight a war just to become the next empire. The galaxy doesn't need rulers or hierarchies or anyone telling entire species how to live. It needs freedom, even if freedom is dangerous." Vexthal's form went completely dark for a moment, then flared with light that seemed to come from internal fires burning out of control. The ambassador raised its crystalline arms in a gesture that might have been surrender or preparation for one final act of defiance. But before it could speak again, alarms began sounding throughout the station. The alerts announced what everyone already knew but had not yet fully accepted. Station Omega-7 was lost, and the Galactic Council no longer existed as a governing body. 3,000 years of enforced order had ended not with a grand ceremony but with the quiet Acknowledgement that no one was afraid anymore. In the days that followed, Jake Morrison found himself offered leadership roles in a dozen different provisional governments but turned them all down. He had not fought to destroy one empire just to build another, and the galaxy needed explorers more than it needed rulers. The Unbroken was refitted for deep space exploration. While its crew was expanded to include beings from across known space, the new galaxy that emerged from the rebellion was chaotic and sometimes violent, but it was also alive in ways that the Council's perfect order had never allowed. Species that had been isolated for centuries began to explore and trade and sometimes fight with each other. New alliances formed and dissolved while old grievances were settled in ways that were not always peaceful, General Barnes established a loose confederation of free worlds that provided mutual defense without imposing central authority. Dr. Parker founded research institutes where beings from different species could work together to solve problems that affected everyone. Captain Morgan started a merchant fleet that carried goods and ideas between worlds that were just learning they had neighbors. Commander Zektar returned to Draconian space and helped his people rebuild their civilization according to principles they chose for themselves. The Nixarians spread throughout the galaxy using their shape-shifting abilities to learn about species they had never met. The Zephyrians and Altarians and Ceruleans all began the long process of healing from centuries of oppression. Jake Morrison took the Unbroken beyond the edge of known space where his mixed crew of humans and aliens encountered species that had never heard of the Galactic Council. When these new civilizations asked about Earth's intentions, Jake gave them the answer. That became the foundation for a new kind of galactic community,